Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Cross and Crown channel is about presenting powerful proof for the Christian faith. If you want to support Mike as he makes videos and writes books, just go to Mike's Patreon page at patreon.com/mrob and kick in $1 or so. If you join us over there, that would be awesome. Supporting this work will help bring countless people to Christ. If you like this video, there's a donation button on our main YouTube page. Thanks for hanging out.
Hello, this is Cross and Crown Radio and the Gospel Truth Podcast. So glad you're with us. We're going to be talking about atheists really do believe in God. How do we know that? Mostly because of Romans chapter 1. Although if you talk to atheists and you have evidence and the proof, you can see how they actually do know God exists as you have that dialogue. But Romans 1 is more important than that. It says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen. So they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God." So that's where they're starting from. Hello, Romeo. It's good to have you, my friend. Researchers, though, scientific researchers found that having atheists merely asking God to harm them or others is just as upsetting as when believers are doing the same thing. Interesting, isn't it? Not when other entities are asked to do it, or just the universe, or they just wish things to happen. No reaction from atheists or believers. But when they invoke God, they reacted when they were hooked up to these type of lie detector tests. The researchers write that the inclusion of sentences that dare God to do good things or bad things and other agents to do good and bad things, but the arousal was only linked with daring God to do bad things. So pixies or just wishing it yourself did not react when they were hooked up to these polygraph type of tests. That's what happens with the atheists as well as the believers. If you profess belief in God, you believe that he answers prayer. So you would rightfully fear asking God to reduce your house to ashes or hurt one of your loved ones. It would be dumb. But if you don't believe in God, would you give it a second thought? Of course they did, actually. So they're not being honest. In the academic work in the International Journal of Psychology of Religion, atheists become emotionally aroused when daring God to do terrible things. Researchers asked subjects to make horrifying statements. Some statements were puppy kicking, some were parents drowning, some dared God to do awful stuff to themselves or their loved ones or their friends. Half the subjects about were atheists and about half were religious. It was done in Finland. The subjects were asked to read aloud statements while hooked up to these lie detector type tests, and they got the idea that they had the same reaction as the believers. The unbelievers and the believers all reacted very similar with these polygraph type of tests, even though the non-believers say, "Oh, I don't believe in God." According to this polygraph type test, the atheists found asking God to harm them or others to be just as upsetting as religious folk did. Let me repeat that. The polygraph test found the atheists asking God to harm them or others to be just as upsetting as religious people did. Not having a pixies or fairies or leprechauns or the universe or just wishing it to be, no reaction from these polygraph type tests, only when they invoked God. So the atheists, like believers, were more bothered by the statement, "I dare God to paralyze my parents." So it's amazing how the atheists claim that they don't believe in God, yet everything about them demonstrates that they actually do. The inclusions of sentences that dare God to do bad things or other agents to do bad things, but the arousal is only linked with the daring God to do bad things. In another study, both atheists and Christians had words like spirit or divine related to them and to test their stress reaction to it. Those primed with God-based words were more persistent with being more anxious, whether they said they believed or not. Both were more anxious when invoking God, whether an atheist or a believer. Another study in 2007 found that using the same type of method, both atheists and believers were more generous towards strangers. They were more generous towards strangers when they were reminded of God. Both atheists and believers. It's amazing, isn't it? In the issue of Journal of Religion, Brain Behavior, several researchers grappled with the dilemma, what are atheists for? In studying this, they said, in touching the survival of the species, atheists might exist for, I quote, the promotion of the unity of the religious communities that they berate. In other words, maybe atheists exist to be hated. Now, that's not what I do, and real Christians don't. We don't hate atheists. We have compassion for them. We feel sorry for them because they know God exists, and yet they play these games and they're just heaping upon themselves more and more judgment. So we need to keep reaching out to them with the truth, defending the truth, caring for them, even with all their silliness, even with all their anger, all these things. It's just a big game, and just go after them with the truth of God's word, his law, and his gospel, and pray that God would bring them to faith, because they actually do know God exists. It says here again in Romans 1, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. So it's always difficult to try to defend atheism. In fact, it's impossible, because